Okay, so now let's discuss the identity federation in AWS. So the idea is that you want to give users that sit outside of AWS permission to access your AWS resources in your accounts, and the idea is that because the users already exist within your corporate directory, then you don't want to create a specific IAM users for them because you would like to do user management outside of AWS. So this is why we need identity federation. So these cases is for like example, your corporation has its own identity system. For example, Active Directory or you have a web and mobile application that needs to access AWS resources. And so this is where we need identity federation. So at its core, here it looks like so like if the user wants to access AWS and we have an identity provider, so first, and this will not be represented on any following graphs, but just on this one. Obviously, you need to set up trust relationship between AWS and the identity provider to tell AWS that it's fine to get an identity from this one provider, and then the user will perform a login onto this identity provider. Will receive back credentials for AWS and will access using these temporary credentials. So identity filtration can have multiple flavors. It could be SAML 2.0, so a custom identity broker, web identity federation with or without Amazon Cognito, and then the most recent single sign-on SSO service. So I'm going to discuss the first three. Single sign-on will have its own lecture, and this is the more recent generation of identity federation. But still, from an exam perspective, you need to know about all of them. So let's get with the SAML 2.0. So SAML 2.0 Federation. So SAML 2.0 Federation stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, and it's an open standard by many identity providers such as ADFS. It supports integration with Microsoft Active Directory, which is nice, or any SAML 2.0 compatible identity provider, which is like the identity provider within the AWS. So using this, we can access the console, the CLI, or any API using temporary credentials. So we don't need to create IAM users for like each of them lies in your ADFS, and you need, for example, of course, to set up a trust between IAM and your SAML 2.0 identity provider both ways. So under the hood, we'll use an API called Assume Role with SAML, comes from the STS service. Assume Role with SAML comes from the STS service, and they will give us temporary credential using SAML assertion. Markup language, SAML assertion. So as I said, SAML 2.0 is the old way, and now the newer Amazon single sign-on service is a new managed in a new management super way to get this working. Okay, but still we have to learn about SAML 2.0 federation in here. So the best way to understand this is to go through a diagram. So we have our corporation where our identity provider sits an AWS and our user wants to access an S3 bucket. Now inside of our corporation we have a portal. Or identity provider, and the user will make an authentication request to the identity provider. The identity provider will verify the request through the identity store, LDAP based identity store, for example LDAP based, and then it will return SAML assertion if the login is successful. So this SAML assertion is a proof that the user is who they claim to be, and therefore with this SAML assertion the user can call the STS service with assume role with SAML API, and STS will verify the assertion and make sure that yes, it is the one that is trusted, and then say okay, here are some temporary security credentials for you, and the user will be able to access the AWS APIs using that mechanism. It is very like even the similar if the user wants to access the console of AWS. So very similar setup. So we still have to we have the IDP identity provider and the LDAP based identity store. We have the authentication loop as I said from the before, but this time we post to AWS sign in this endpoint with /SAML, and what this will return is that it will return a security credential through the STS service, and this will return a special URL, the signing URL for the AWS console, and this URL will be used by the user to be redirected into the AWS management console, and from there on everything is good. So these two flows are very similar because they use the same SAML 2.0 federation. Now if we have ADFS, it's something you may have. Well, it is the exact same mechanism as before. The only difference is that on the left hand side we have the Microsoft Active Directory Federation service on the top left, and then on the bottom where the user sits is the Active Directory itself, Microsoft Active Directory itself. Okay, so this is for you to understand what is the difference between the identity provider, so ADFS, and the directory itself, which is the Active Directory. Okay, now more complicated and definitely older is that, like, if your identity provider is not compatible with SAML 2.0, then you need to use a custom identity broker. So let's say we want to access AWS services and the management console, and we have our corporation identity provider. We'll have custom identity broker. Now the user will log into the identity broker, which will verify the login itself, but then the identity broker will be the one to authenticate the request temporary credentials from AWS. So this time there is no AWS API that can be used, so therefore the custom identity broker has admin power and can request temporary credentials directly from the STS service, which will be returning these credentials themselves. Now that means that identity broker is responsible and must determine appropriate IAM role for that user. So it pushes the management of the users into the identity broker itself. Then the only way for it to work is to use the assume role or get federation token API from STS directly from the custom identity broker. So once the security credentials are retrieved, then they are passed on to the users, and the user can access the APIs, AWS, or be redirected through the management console. So again, there are old ways of doing things. So SSO will come up later in this course. Now here we have with Web Identity Federation, we have two flavors. We have without Cognito and with Cognito. So without Cognito is not recommended by AWS anymore. It is recommended to use Cognito instead, but still you need to know about it. So what is Web Identity Federation? So this time we have an untrusted environment. So before it was our corporation. So we knew the client, but in this case it is cloud, and we want to access services from our client directly. But we are going to authenticate with a third-party identity provider. It could be Amazon, Google, Facebook, or any OpenID Connect compatible IDP. So this obviously will be set up with AWS as a trust mechanism, and so the flow is that the client will log in into the identity provider IDP. So the third party IDP, and then the web identity token is going to be shared back with the clients. The client will use a special STS API called the assume role with web identity API, and then by trading that token, it will receive a temporary security credential for AWS. These credentials will be used to access AWS resources directly. So this is the old way without Cognito, and we have with Cognito. It's a little bit more secure and more simple. So it's preferred over Web Identity Federation because here in Cognito we can create IAM roles with the least privileged needed, and then we just need to build the trust between the OIDC IDP and OpenID Connect IDP identity provider and AWS. So now we have the Cognito service. the client still authenticates to a third-party identity provider, gets a token back, but then the token is exchanged with Amazon Cognito, which will return a Cognito token. That Cognito token can be exchanged with STS to receive a temporary security credential for AWS, and then the client will be able to access the AWS resources directly. So why should we use this mechanism with Cognito? Well, Cognito will support anonymous users, which is a plus. It will support MFA and it will have data synchronization. So in that instance, Mission Cognito operates at what's called a token vending machine because it exchanges tokens for credentials. So now we have Web Identity Federation. Can we restrict IAM policy? Can we restrict IAM policy? The answer is yes. You can use an IAM policy variable, and so here is an example of a policy that allows the user to only list a bucket with a prefix as the user ID, user underscore ID, and also to get update and put objects with a specific prefix. So the idea is that when you have a web identity federation, you can use some special variables. For example, cognito-identity.amazonaws.com:sub or amazon.com:user, amazon.com:user_id, and so on, to restrict your IAM policy with condition and make sure that the users really have the restriction that they need. So that's it for the identity federation. And these are the old ways, obviously, except what me using Cognito, and we'll see SSO in the future lecture. So hope you like this, and I would strongly suggest to revisit this lecture one more time before exam, and it should all make sense. And I'll see you in the next lecture.